Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan. This is another Psych with Mike, and I am here as always with my fabulous and knowledgeable guest host, Mr. Brett Newcomb.
Hello.
I did that for you because it is the holiday season, and I'm being gracious and understanding and sympathetic to my fellow man.
Well, I'm sitting here across from you in real time and really looking at you, but both of us have computers and iPads in front of us that we're watching instead.
We do.
Which is a perfect lead into what we want to talk about today, which we want to talk about mediated conversations. Years and years ago, I read a study by two sociologists named Albert Mehrabian and Kenneth Cooper that talked about how we communicate, and that the content of the message that is communicated is only about 7% made up of the words that we use. The rest of it are the nonverbals that accompany the verbal message. So I could say to a child growing up who is being chastised by his parents, "Yes, ma'am," meaning, yes, I absolutely hear you, I agree with you, I willingly will accommodate what you're asking me. Or I could say, "Yes, ma'am," in a way that communicated, there's no way in the hell that this is going to happen, and so do your worst. The words are the same. The message is dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that we reference that today for our discussion is we want to talk about how many people are using iPads and cell phones and tablets to connect themselves to others, but without being able to see those others directly or to experience the inflection of the word or the hesitant pause of the breathing as somebody packages a verbal message to give us. And so we miss a lot of what's going on. I'm reminded several years back, we had a Super Bowl party at our house with a dozen adults and 15 kids. We were all sitting in this gigantic room, the TV was on and the game was on. And I looked around and every one of the teenage boys in the room had their cell phones out, and they were texting each other in the room, having a sub rosa conversation about the adults in the room, about the ball game, about whatever else they were talking about. Who knows? But it was like an aha moment for me to realize that there were parallel universes in existence in that same room of people that were all physically in the same space.
And last week we were talking about this concept of the Norman Rockwell ideal and the ability or inability for most of us to be able to achieve that, especially in association with the holiday season. And we wanted to talk about loneliness during the holidays. And one of the things that I think we agree causes this sense of loneliness is a sense of disaffection or disconnection. And one of the things that is creating a more persistent sense of disconnection are screens, and people don't recognize it. So I did want to mention that we are trying to create an immersive experience with Psych with Mike. And so when you look for these either through psychwithmike.com or wherever you pick up the show, we are including links to some of the information that we reference when we talk about these different things. So make sure that you're looking for those when you pick up the podcast. But one of the things that I am going to put on the website this week is an Atlantic article that I was looking at on the iGen generation. So the generation of individuals now that has only exclusively grown up with these screens. And the idea that they are very, quote, connected. Mm-hmm. They have more friends than you and I could ever possibly have assumed that a person could have, but they're not having real conversations.
Right.
Just as you said, they're not experiencing the nonverbals. And so these individuals are connected, at least perceptually connected, but they're not having real interactions. And what we see is that there's a concomitant increase in the levels of depression that people have as there is a growth in the amount of time that they spend looking at screens. And nowadays, when people are doing so much of their shopping and everything else over the holiday season connected to a screen, they're not having those human interactions.
Right. My wife and I just flew back from Tucson a week or so ago. And on the plane, there were several young children, a year to 5 years old. And we remembered that when our child was that young and we traveled, we took a bag of entertaining devices, a deck of cards, soft toys to play with. And we interacted with the child. We read a book to them on the plane to entertain them or keep them from screaming and crying and carrying on. And what we saw in every case on this plane is that the parents just handed their kid an iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
And the kid was playing games on the iPhone or looking at whatever as a way to entertain them. And so we are teaching them that when you feel frustrated, when you can't control yourself, when you're mad or hungry or whatever, go to what really matters in your life, which is a handheld device.
And I have actually had clients say to me in therapy, my child is brilliant. And I say, well, okay, all parents think their children are brilliant. And from your perspective, that may be true. And I'm not going to argue that. But why do you think your child is brilliant? And have had parents say to me, well, they're only X number of months old, 8, 10 months old, and they can use an iPad.
Yeah.
Well, your child doesn't read. I don't care what you believe, that just isn't happening. Your child's not reading. And if there are people who are listening to this in the audience who say, well, but my child read at 8 months. Okay. I'm not going to argue that, but psychologically, physiologically.
Especially if your child's a male. The research data doesn't support that.
Yeah. And so what is the child doing? The child is learning how to be able to, tap on the screen in certain places. It's habituation and get some kind of desired result, which is fantastic.
Lights, movement, sound.
Right.
Yeah.
But is that really what we want our children? Are those the skill sets that we believe are important for our children to have? And what are we teaching them, just as you said, to do if we are training them that their emotional regulation is tied to that screen? How are they going to be able to disconnect from that?
Phyllis was looking on Facebook yesterday, and someone had posted a video of a child, maybe a year old, throwing a blue screaming fit, kicking, screaming, whatever. And then the parents handed this child an iPhone, and the child tapped the screen, and it lit up, and they started smiling and giggling, and then they took it away from them, and they went back to a screaming fit. So what they're learning for emotional regulation or emotional domination is to just scream and throw a fit until you get what you want.
Right.
And what you want, in this case, that satisfies you is an interactive device that you can play with instead of attending to another person and negotiating for what you want in a mutual, satisfactory way of interaction. So we see that in marriages. We see that in social relationships, groups of friends, what have you. They are more and more preferring not to call one another and talk to each other, but to text one another. And they avoid, for whatever reason, and however unconsciously, they avoid opportunities to get together face to face and have a dialogue with, especially if there's something of significance or of emotional significance that needs to be discussed. Can we not just text about this? I remember my son years ago was down in the basement playing video games, and I was upstairs watching something on the television, so we were each being entertained by screens. But he texted me, and he said, "Dad, I need to have a conversation with you." And I'm like, "Fine, come on up." And he says, "No, I want to have it this way." And I said, "Well, what is it that you want to talk about?" "What do you do when your best friend says he's suicidal?" I said, "Turn off your screen, come upstairs, sit down across from me, and we'll discuss it." He didn't want to have that conversation face to face.
Right, because the reality of the emotional intensity is too threatening for people.
Right.
And I get that all the time in therapy. People want to have these emotional conversations over text. And I say to them all the time, any emotion that you think you are reading in a text is a projection. It's your projection onto that other person. They say, "No, but you don't understand. They're emojis." And I say all the time, and I say, no, it doesn't matter how many emojis are included. That is not a substitute for nonverbal interpretation. Right. But people are confused convinced
Right.
that they can have these emotional conversations via some kind of printed word, and that is real, Brett, and they believe it.
Yeah. But I'm laughing because Phyllis and I have a mutual friend who was texting us the other day about some really serious thing. And I wrote a paragraph in response. And Phyllis's response was, Brett has all the words, so I'll just send you some loving emojis.
Mm-hmm.
And she had 3 or 4 in a row that she had strung up there and sent to our friend. So that's exactly what you're talking about.
Right. But even if you get the emoji, it's still a projection. If I'm in the room with you, then I'm reading your nonverbal behavior. I'm reading your micro expressions, and my empathic response mechanisms in my brain are causing me to have an emotional reaction based on the way that you behave.
Yeah.
If you send me an emoji, then I am projecting my sense onto that emoji, which may be real, and it may be the same as what you intend, but it may not. It may be different.
And the odds are 50-50 or worse.
Or worse.
Yeah. So you go back to Cooper and Moravian talking about the preponderant part of a message communication, what they call direct communication, is tone of voice, facial expression, body gestures, distance, space. Those all are communicative. They have message value that we don't receive if we use a device.
Right.
What they call a mediated conversation.
And micro expressions pass across the human face. So these are things that you can't even train out if you go through interrogation training at a high level in a military organization. So your body has these things called micro expressions, which only happen for tenths of a second and happen faster than the frame rate on a camera, which is 35 frames per minute. And what that means is that your eye is capable of detecting these micro expressions that pass faster than you could interpret by looking at even an image on an iMessage. So even if you're FaceTiming somebody, you miss out on some of those micro expressions, but you experience them in real life.
Yeah, and that's especially problematic if you're communicating with somebody in a second language or third language that didn't originate from your cultural language. So if someone's moved here or immigrated from another country and you have a conversation with them in English, if you're texting back and forth, all those nuances get lost that give you an opportunity to understand. They didn't quite get it. They didn't quite understand what I wanted to communicate.
But you know that because you are with them in real time.
Yes.
So this is one of the most telling references in this Atlantic article, and what it says is that the average 12th grader in 2015 left the house, went out and actually interacted with friends on a social level less frequently than the average 8th grader did in 2009.
That's stunning. But I have a 23-year-old, and he's a computer programmer. That's his profession. So he works on a computer all day, and then he comes home and he gets on the internet. He plays video games on the internet with friends.
Right.
Who live down the street, who could come over. They could all be in the same room. And sometimes they are. And they have multiple controllers, and they're all playing the same game together. When he was in college, we'd go visit him, and his dorm had 4 little bedrooms in it in a central area. And his roommates and he would all be playing the same video game against one another.
But in different rooms.
In separate bedrooms with the doors closed and headphones on. And I'm like, the hell are you doing? And he said, well, we're all connected. We're all sharing. We're all enjoying. And for his reality, it's so different than mine. And I have trouble understanding that. And I have worries because of these other elements that we're talking about the downstream impact on his relational skills and his ability to connect to other people to get his emotional needs met.
And bringing that back to this series that we've been doing on the holidays, you know, the more that people are looking at these screens, the less that they are having these one-to-one interactions, the more that people feel disconnected. They can tell themselves, well, I feel very connected because I'm having lots and lots of interactions. But psychologically, it isn't the same, and it isn't satisfying the same psychological need. Humans in isolation go insane and die. That's just true. And even if you're fed, even if you're kept warm, we know that there is something that we crave at a biological molecular level that can't be fooled into believing that it is satisfied just because you're having a conversation over a screen.
What's the name of the monkey experiment? The rhesus monkey, where they gave the one a doll and the other one was isolated with no doll and died.
Yes. Harlow.
Yes, Bryce Harlow.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bryce Harlow. But anyway, Harlow did an experiment on that with monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And they took babies and put them in a cage alone with no mother to nurture them or hold them. And they've made a doll of a mother. And the little monkey would go crawl up in the doll's arms and receive sustenance and stay alive. Mm-hmm. And the one that didn't have the doll, that just had the cage, even though they had food and water supplied, curl up in a ball and die from loneliness and isolation.
So that is something that even at a lower level than human beings we know is essential. And at our level is even more essential because we're even more communal than monkeys are. And when we deprive ourselves of that, that has real, not only psychological, but physiological consequences. And that really can have an impact when we're talking about the holiday season, where the scripting is, we were talking about the Norman Rockwell scripting, is that we are all connected and everybody feels great and there's so much love. And yet we're not feeling that because we're much more on our screens. You know, I was coming home from Florida and over the weekend when you guys were coming back from Arizona, and I was in the airport, and this lady, I mean, she was a middle-aged woman, ran into me like a linebacker because she was looking down at her screen. Right. And didn't even look up from the screen when she ran into me and said, "Oh, I'm sorry," which was a cursory thing that she said.
Reflexive.
But she wasn't, right. She wasn't engaged with me. She wasn't looking at me in the eye.
And she didn't stop what she was doing.
No, she continued to look at her phone. And as she walked past me, I'm not making this up, ran over my foot with her luggage bag.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's going to get worse when Google is successful in creating a marketable Google glasses that are connected to your computer and you can read the screen and people can't see that that's what you're doing. I mean, it's a really interesting projection for where our culture is going to go. You and I both think that there's a significant loss of interpersonal, interactive connection that will lead to more isolation, more depression, more suicide, and less cohesive families and friendships.
Because the thing that correlates, everybody thinks when you talk about mass shootings, you talk about suicide, the thing that correlates with that is being bullied and things like that. That's actually not true. Statistically, the only thing that correlates with mass shootings, with suicides, and other acts of aggression, whether they be against the individual or against other persons, is the extent to which the individual feels socially disconnected. And people are creating a greater degree of this social disconnection because of the focus that we have on screens. And if it's not something that we look at soon, then we are going to see definitive impacts on society at a broader level, not just during the holidays.
But this is an issue that we've known about for a long time. In 1877, a French sociologist named Émile Durkheim published an article, a scientific study that he had done on suicide. And one of the primary types of suicide was what he called anomony, which means social isolation. You get so socially disconnected that you don't feel you have value or connection to anybody else, and so life isn't worth living, and you kill yourself.
And that's going to be the focus of our next episode is going to be suicide, which is an incredibly important topic. So we really encourage everybody to tune in for that, because I think we're going to have some really good information that not only is going to surprise people, but might actually be significantly beneficial for some individuals. So join us next week for a new Psych with Mike. As always, all of the music on Psych with Mike is written and arranged, performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and we thank him for that. And we will talk to you next week for another Psych with Mike.